Hello, everyone, and welcome to Transcelerate's webinar on what you need to know about ICH E8R1. We're here today to talk about our tools that our work stream has put together to really help us, as well as you, interpret these guidelines. Next slide, please. Our agenda for today, we're going to go through a little bit logistics and ground rules. I'll just talk for a few minutes about Transcelerate itself. And then we're really going to get into the meat where we talk about what ICH E8R1 is, the focus of our work and the topics that were chosen, and talk a little bit about what our tools are and definitely allow some time for question and answers. Next slide. For the webinar, you are muted. I think you know that. And the audio, you use your computer audio. I think you can hear me. We're good there. You can reduce the control panel for better view for the presentations as indicated on the slide. And if you have a question that occurs to you after, as we're going through the presentation, please use the Q&A function in the webinar, not the chat. We will be trying to get to as many of the questions as possible, but we will use the Q&A function to be able to send out answers to any questions that we have that we do not get a chance to answer. Next slide, please. Couple of ground rules. We want to make sure that we're making this discussion helpful, but we want to make sure that everyone knows that participation in this webinar and using any of Transcelerate's tools is voluntary. The responsibility for compliance with laws and regulations is in the end the person who is actually conducting the study or adopting the solution. And you don't have to identify yourself in your questions or what company you work for. This can be completely anonymous. A couple things that we will not discuss. We will not discuss specifics of vendors, sites, CROs, company names, any issues with any of those things, any long-term development plans, or anything related to costs or pricing. Next slide. So who is Transcelerate? Uh-oh, the lights went off in the room. Sorry, guys. I'm not too dark. Transcelerate is a not-for-profit consortia of biopharma companies with large R&D organizations, and they engage in the development of new medicines. These members really understand the issues associated with this development, and it's their knowledge and insights that help us develop useful solutions. Our main areas of focus for these solutions are clinical development and drug safety. Next slide. Even though as Transcelerate, we are a single stakeholder organization, we do seek input in the development of our solutions from the entire ecosystem. The over 100 plus solutions that we have developed, which are on our website for anyone to use, are in the areas of focus that are on the right-hand side of this slide. If you have not looked at our website, if you are new to Transcelerate and you have interest in any one of those areas, please take a look and see if these solutions will be helpful to you. Next slide. So for the conversation today, it's going to be led by Melissa Supran, who is Head of Quality Risk Management at Pfizer. We also have a panelist today who was slated to be a speaker, but unfortunately does not have a voice, so they will not be able to participate. But Tashan Mistry is here to be able to help with answering any questions in her area of expertise. On the slide you see here on the right-hand side, we also have a team that was behind our speakers who helped work on all of these solutions. If they're within your company and you have a question, please feel free to reach out to them. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Melissa Supran.
Hey, Patrice, thanks for the introduction. Welcome, everyone. I'm so excited that we're all here to talk about this important topic of quality in clinical trials. Transcelerate thought it was important enough to charter a team around and have us work on some solutions to help the industry with implementation and adoption after the changes in the recent revision of ICH E8. I did want to start from the beginning and make sure, since I'm going to use the ICH acronym a lot today, that everybody knows what it means. So ICH at the bottom of this slide stands for the International Council for Harmonization of Technical Requirements for Pharmaceuticals for Human Use. And that is why we use the acronym ICH, because it's a very long name. So ICH is an organization that's made up of regulatory authorities and industry, and they come together to make guidance that helps us all achieve quality in clinical trials, regardless of where those trials are being run. Not all countries participate, but many do. You can go out to the ich.org website and see more details about that. But that's a little bit of background on ICH. E8 is an efficacy guideline. So that's a guideline that is part of the clinical trials space. How we came up with 8 as the overarching guideline after the other 7, I'm not sure. It would be great if someone has that tidbit of knowledge to put it in the trivia section in the chat. But nonetheless, E8 is an overarching guideline. So it works hand in hand with ICH E6, both of which are recently revised. E8 is completed, E6 is in progress. And so we did get a question in from the registration about what's the timing with E6 and E8. E8's already been revised as part of the modernization of the guidance. And E6 follows because it's a more detailed guidance that falls underneath. So E8's been updated. It hadn't been updated since the 1990s, and a lot has changed since then. There could even be people on this call who don't remember the 1990s. So lots has changed, and we've summarized that as E8's been updated to reflect the increasing complexity of clinical trials, but really a lot has changed. So the update focused on the increased role of stakeholders and the broader perspective that the industry has in the pharma ecosystem than just a few stakeholders, and certainly focus on healthcare professionals and study participants. It also focuses on quality a little bit differently. So where it used to be more about rote application of the same controls over and over to clinical trials, we're now taking a more quality by design approach where we're looking at the specifics of what we're doing in any one activity, defining what's important with critical to quality factors, and then focusing on fit for purpose controls and application of quality. So those are some shifts. They're reflective of shifts that have been going on in the industry for some time, but they are updates from the perspective of the guidance itself. Next slide, please. So why do we do all of this in ICH E8? It's the top of the house here, right? The most important part is the protection of study participants and the reliability of study results. We want to make sure we're looking out for the right safety and well-being of participants, regardless of what country we're operating in, and that the study results are valid and repeatable and reliable when we submit them for approval. So E8, again, is that overarching high-level considerations for clinical studies. It is linked to a number of other guidances, but very closely aligned to ICH E6, where there's more detailed expectations and responsibilities on a number of topics, which we won't talk about today, but we probably will talk about at some future webinar. Next slide. So given all of that, right, given all of the change and all of the challenge and the updates that ICH has made, this team that put together this webinar today was really looking to help with implementation around some of those changes. What is the interpretation of what's changed and how might we implement it? What are some solutions that might be helpful across the industry? So not surprisingly, we reviewed the changes. We also reviewed some of the perspectives that other folks around the industry had about those changes. We conducted a survey of Transcelerate member companies, and you'll see more of that later. And that survey helped inform where are people struggling with implementation or where are there opportunities for a deeper implementation of the concepts in ICH E8. We then put together a framework for how that implementation might look, and then 7 solutions resulted from that. So that's where we are today. We have those solutions available to share with you, and we will talk a little bit more about those in a moment. So if we could go to the next slide. So you are getting bits and pieces of one of those tools right now. Several of the slides we've shown you are the ICH-E8 infographic, and it highlights many of the concepts that are different. So again, you can have this conversation with whoever you want to have this conversation with. And this gives you a little bit of insight into what that looks like. But again, we're trying to address the changes in the pharma ecosystem that were addressed with ICH-E8, the increase in focus on patient-focused drug development, and the concepts that support that, right? Quality by design, fit for purpose, application of quality controls, focusing our attention and our efforts using critical to quality factors. And then one where I really just want to emphasize, in order to make that shift, the culture has to be there as well. So you can't shift from rote application of controls the same way over and over again and not expect to have to change the culture along with that. And so some of the things that are called out in E8 as important to that are making sure your organization is capable of critical thinking, that you can have open, proactive dialogue about what's critical to quality and what might go wrong. And that culture is really supported for encouraging stakeholder engagement. Not surprisingly, we want protocols to be well designed and operationally feasible, right? If they're not feasible, it's going to be really hard to do them with quality. And then, as I mentioned before, we're increasing the perspective on stakeholder engagement and how many people are involved. So our tools are focused on helping us adopt those areas where there's changes in the R1 revision of E8. Next slide, please. Thanks, you can keep going to the next one. So one of the tools I mentioned was the survey or landscape assessment, and we used that survey to help us understand which types of solutions might be helpful to folks who are wanting to implement these concepts. And so of those, out of that survey came the results that you see here, and a number of these are the things that we developed, and you'll see the examples of those which I'll talk through in a minute. But the landscape assessment really gave us the insight into both which topic areas folks might be interested in and which solutions might be helpful to support those topic areas. So this is just one indication of that. I will note that the landscape assessment was about a year ago, so this might change right now that we've developed some of these solutions and rolled them out, right? If we ask the question again, I don't know if we get a different answer or not, but this is what informed our work up until this point. Next slide. And then you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So this is really where we start to get into the solutions, and this is the meat of the conversation today. These are the 7 areas, or the 7 solutions that we worked on, and we hope that they'll help you in implementation. We did get a question about, how does this relate to other members of the pharma ecosystem who aren't part of the TransCelerate member companies, and we really hope that it helps support your attention to quality too, that it helps with your understanding of what's important to sponsors and what's important to participants and to regulatory authorities as well. We all work in that same space, and we hope that these are, free and available resources that you can pick up and use for implementation. So we have the landscape assessment, which we talked a little bit about already, was a bunch of questions that we asked TransCelerate member companies to give us their perspective on ICH-E8. We have an infographic, which you've seen pieces of already as well. We hope you'll pick that up and use it everywhere you go. We have a stakeholder engagement tool, which we'll walk through and show you some examples of, a culture and engagement resource pack, some tools around CTQs, some case studies, which are real examples of quality in action, and in the not too distant future, we will have a white paper published as well, and that kind of ties all of the concepts together. So looking forward to that. So with that, we can move to the next slide. And this is our first polling question. So interested to understand from this audience, which parts of ICH-E R1 have been most difficult for you to implement? And we'll just give this a minute or two, and we'll know we're done when we see the results. Interesting. So it looks like critical to quality factor implementation is the winner, but they all got some votes. So that's pretty consistent with where we were working as well. And so we'll share with you, and I'll emphasize when we get to the tool around critical to quality factor, but we'll talk about all of them today based on what's here. Thanks. So first, we're going to talk about the landscape assessment. The landscape assessment is kind of fun. It's an interesting data set. Again, it's a year old, but I still find it interesting in terms of benchmarking. It shows how the responding companies have progressed toward implementation of E8, and it gives an understanding of the interpretation of those key concepts at the time. It's a great resource if you're starting an implementation just to see where you stand and how far you might have to go. And I found it useful just when helping planning improvements to the quality management system. So there's quite a bit more than we're going to show you today. So we do hope that you'll go out and find this and take a more detailed look through it. But if you go to the next slide, this just gives you an idea of what the output looks like. Not expecting you to study this today, but it gives you a sense of where the companies that responded were in terms of implementation. All of the answers are just displayed graphically, and it gives you a sense of where they are. So from left to right, the dark to light goes from where they're considering an approach to where they've fully embedded an approach in their organization. So you can see there's a lot of variation and a lot of room for improvement, and that's where we felt like there was an opportunity for this work to happen. So definitely take a look at that and see what other nuggets you can pull out of it. But I found it to be really interesting for benchmarking and background. So that's the landscape assessment. And then next slide, we'll talk about the infographic. So again, this is the one you can pull out at any old party and teach everybody about ICHE8. It's a very easy to use tool, and hopefully it gives some idea of what this is all about without going into too much detail, but enough that you could pull it out and use it in slides. You could pull it out and use it for a presentation and hopefully not have to do too much to it. That's what we were hoping. And so it identifies those key concepts to understand E8 and understand quality in clinical trials and how it kind of all fits in, how E8 and E6 are related, and what's changed recently in the guidance. So if you go to the next slide, this is the one piece of the infographic you haven't seen yet. All the other pieces appeared on prior slides. And you get the sense that, we've put all of the concepts here for quick reference. It gives a brief description of what each of the things is, and groups into categories between the building quality and culture and engagement. Obviously, those go hand in hand. We don't mean to say that you could do one without the other, just that they fit in those categories. And I think if you're going to work on implementation, you might take a slightly different approach to each. But nonetheless, all the concepts are there, and it gives you an idea of kind of what you can do with that from an ICHE8 perspective, right? If we just talk about ICHE8 all the time, it doesn't sound like much, right? This gives it a little bit more context and a little bit more meaning. Next slide. All right, the stakeholder engagement tool. So this is reflective of the change in ICHE8 to have a broader perspective on stakeholders. We've looked at this a couple of different ways, internal stakeholders and external stakeholders, and both are important. We've grouped them that way just because it was too much to try to fit them all in one spot, but it's an interactive tool that allows you to click through each of the stakeholders and look at when and why they might be involved in activities in the quality space, and then potentially how to involve them. Obviously, every company has to make their own decision about when, why, and how to involve stakeholders. These are ideas, though, if you're starting from nothing, or even if you have a seasoned program, but maybe there's one or two stakeholders that you haven't involved yet that are mentioned in ICHE8, this would give you some ways to potentially look at that. So internal stakeholders, external stakeholders, and then ways that you can potentially interact with them. So if we go to the next slide. So this is the internal stakeholder engagement example. This is what the tool looks like when you get into it. And you can click into any of these names on the wheel. We're going to click into one today just to give you an example. Obviously, it's reflective of the fact that many functions collaborate on planning and delivering a successful clinical trial, but we don't have time to go through all of them today. So we'll go through one example and just give you a sense of what's in the tool. But the same content exists for each of the roles that's named on the wheel. I did just want to mention that there's a relationship here between the stakeholder map and the work that we did in the landscape assessment. So when you look at the landscape assessment, I thought it was really interesting when it talks about when different roles are involved. And I think that was, again, an interesting reflection on potential opportunities in the industry to involve some roles sooner than later, particularly as we're trying to be proactive and planful and preventing issues. So we're going to click into the safety and medical monitoring. And this is what you would see if you clicked on that in the tool. It will pop up the why, what, and when of interaction with safety monitoring and medical monitoring. It also gives you the references to the different ICH components that are related to this topic. And it gives you, again, some information to consider when you're thinking about why, what, and when to involve the stakeholder. You can click back. We won't click back, but you could, in the actual tool, click back to the internal stakeholders home on the right. We're going to click forward into how to engage. And that's going to show us, again, some options. Not everybody has all of these. Not everybody may want to have all of these, but they're just opportunities for, if you're not engaging the stakeholder today, thinking about how you might engage them in the future. Some of them may seem obvious to some and not to others. And there's no expectation that everyone's involving everyone in all of these all the time. It's more, how do we make that shift to broader stakeholder engagement and not just, when there's a particular task to do or at the time that there's an issue. So that's it on the stakeholder engagement tool for now. Like I said, there's a lot more in the tool. We just wanted to give you an example today. So we're going to move next to the next slide. Thanks, to the culture and engagement resource pack. So as I talked about before, culture and engagement are really important, particularly if we want to get this type of quality by design approach right. Also really important if we want to get the not just quality by design right, but if we want to get quality right in general, right? If we want to be able to take that risk-based approach. So in the culture engagement resource pack, we talk about critical thinking, growth mindset, and open dialogue, and applying them throughout the clinical life cycle, embedding them throughout the process, but also paying attention to them, particularly at critical points when decisions are being made or things are being put in motion. So these are not new concepts, and we recognize that there are lots of resources out there already that are available on these topics. So we didn't try to recreate these specifically from a clinical development perspective because there's so much out there already, but we did put them all in one place. And when I say all, probably isn't all, there's probably more resources out there, but we tried to pick the most relevant ones and put them all in one place so folks could get some additional and deeper understanding and knowledge of this topic. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see an example of that. And I would just say that this is aimed at folks who want to have that deeper understanding, right? If you really want to know what's behind the concepts on critical thinking, if you're going to be the one that's doing the implementation, if you want to understand the theories around them, right? There's a lot here that starts from the high level description of what it is and goes all the way to the details of the theory behind it. So lots of resources here, lots of things you could refer to for that deeper level of understanding. We'll see if this is sufficient in terms of implementation resources, but my guess is this is an area we might revisit when we talk about ICHE 6. And that will be potentially a future work of this team, but I think it's something we'll consider and revisit again to see if this went far enough. So there are lots more resources than what's shown on this page. This is meant to just give you a snapshot of where the topic is mentioned, right? So this particular one is related to open proactive dialogue. It's mentioned in all the things that are listed on the slide. And if you're looking to find out more, you can go into those resources and learn about open proactive dialogue and the other topics that are included in the culture and engagement resource pack. So we'll move to the next one. So CTQs, lots of questions about CTQs. This is one that you guys just said in the poll, has a lot of questions around it as well. And we tried to create a tool that gives a visual framework for implementation that highlights both the shifts in ICHE 8 with critical to quality factors and and addresses the struggle that some of us have with figuring out which CTQs to apply when. So there's two pieces to this. One is that we want to be able to identify critical to quality factors easily. And those might be different in different parts of clinical development. They're going to be different by company, right? There's no magical answer to you should always look at these three because that would be contrary to our quality by design approach. It would also be contrary to taking a risk-based approach. We want to be focused on, again, the things that are critical for that particular application. So we talk a little bit about that in this tool. We also have outlined a framework that gives a sense that is consistent with the shift in E8, where it's not just about one study at a time. The application of critical to quality factors is about the whole clinical development life cycle and how we apply from the early thinking to the end and not just when the study starts and during study execution. And that helps us understand, what's critical from one study to the next, what's important well before you get into talking about the specifics of what's going to be monitored, and being able to build some of those concepts in to the early planning that's done, whether it's clinical development planning or drafting of a protocol, as opposed to later in the process. So there's resources here that help with implementation of those CTQ factors, and we'll give you a quick insight into what those look like. Again, this is just a snapshot of what's in the tool on the next slide. There it is. So this is the CTQ framework from a clinical development perspective. And so it's really meant to draw your attention to more than just the one study at a time. It also gives some examples of potential CTQs at the different phases. Again, none of these are required or even recommended. They're just ideas for you to consider in your process. You may find it helpful as you're implementing a CTQ process to look at it in two ways. One, we've got critical data and processes that we've been identifying for a while related to the work that was implemented under ICHE 6. And so those critical data and processes really are critical to quality factors. They're just specific ones. And so this draws us back to a somewhat higher level where we're coming up from the just data and processes to a broader perspective on critical to quality factors. And so they really could be anything that's important to, again, that participant protection, participant rights, safety, and well-being, and reliability of trial results. And it's going to depend on, your particular situation, application, mode of operation. Are you working with a CRO or are you doing things internally? Those controls may look different. Those CTQs could potentially look different, right? So, looking at the way your particular situation is set up comes back to, you need that critical thinking to be able to make this work, and to be able to pick the right critical to quality factors to work against. So that's one view that's in the CTQ tool. If you go to the next slide, this one is at the study level. And so if you wanted to focus in a little bit more, it talks about kind of how and when you could look at implementation of CTQs. Again, wanting to push it as early as we can. The earlier we get those quality considerations in, the better shot we have at making sure we avoid issues later. So this is, again, another view. Would encourage you to look, if this is a topic that's of interest, would encourage you to really dig into this tool and look at the way that it's being, that it's outlining a potential way to do this. So if we move to the next slide. So this is one of my favorites. These are the ICH-E8 case studies. I think for all of the stuff we just talked about, which is sort of the theoretical, how you could do it, the case studies are 3 great examples of how someone actually did apply these. So there's one on critical to quality factors, which hopefully is helpful to those folks who saw that as an area of struggle. I think it's a great example, and I'll talk more about that one in a minute. We also have one on open dialogue. Again, a hard one to capture, but I think, great to have an example in hand, and then stakeholder engagement. None of these work independently, right? We don't have an example that only has open dialogue, because if you stopped at open dialogue, you wouldn't actually do anything, right? But there are other elements of quality management at work in these as well. But we chose them to highlight those particular concepts, and concepts where folks, again, needed some concrete examples of what these things are and what they look like now that they've been emphasized in ICH-E8. So if we go to the next slide, this is one of the case studies. I don't expect you to read it all today. I'll give you the quick summary, which is there was a team once upon a time who was developing a protocol, and they identified critical to quality factors around inclusion, exclusion criteria, and patient eligibility. They used patient eligibility and inclusion, exclusion as a critical to quality factor because they were really focused on keeping participants safe and making sure that the right participants got into the trial. So hopefully you can envision the extension to things that you might be working on. It was one of the areas the team then focused on in the risk assessment and focused their resources on a control, and identified that they needed to be able to do real-time monitoring of participant eligibility to really focus on this particular factor. So we've highlighted at the bottom some of the sections of E8 that the case study demonstrates, if you really want to get into the specifics there. And then on the next slide, they did identify that there were some challenges in implementation. So a cadence of the data review and time for intervention was important, right? If you get the data to review, but then you don't review it for a while, something's still happening in the interim. And so that was one of the things they talked about, the right metrics, site level versus participant level, implementing the querying and escalation process. And then the things they felt were success factors was the application of a new technology, cross-functional collaboration and frequent communication, and prioritization of the risks that needed controls, which again, they did using critical to quality factors as well. And vendor management and oversight when they have a role in implementing controls. So I thought that was a really interesting one too. The results were that they were ultimately able to achieve a status of having no violations of inclusion exclusion criteria. So a really great example there. I will just note that for each of these case studies on the left-hand side, you'll see a list of the related solutions. So if you wanted to go look at any of the things that are related in terms of the CTQ factors tool or the stakeholder engagement tool, as I said, they don't really work independently. Like we've pulled out this as an example, but lots of things at play here, and certainly representative of some of the other examples that we have too. And they were focused on participant safety, which is always great. Thanks. You can go to the next slide. So we don't have the publication to share with you today, but we will soon. So I would say if you've signed up for TransCelerate Communications, you'll see it there, or if you follow social media that TransCelerate uses, you'll see it there as well. We do expect that that's imminent, and it's a nice way to tie all the concepts together. So much like we tried to do in this webinar today, but as a handy, walk away reference, I think it'll be a nice summary of all of the work that's been done. So with that, we're going to go to our second polling question, and this one is a lead-in to some future work. So as we look ahead to ICH E6 R3, which will be the next revision of R3, what concerns do you have coming out of that and the implementation there? All right, so we got some good variety here too. Interesting. And we don't know exactly what E6 R3 is going to say yet, but it's interesting that quality by design and CTQ is still high on the list. So that may be something we want to address again or in more detail in terms of documentation. Data governance, certainly of interest, right? And when you think about how long it's been since the last update of some of these things, lots has changed in the data space. So great, this is really helpful and informative for us as we look ahead. I kind of wish we had put something on there that said all of the above, because I think some of us are concerned about all of the above, but I think that's a helpful lead in to the next potential body of work. All right, so let's go to our last, well, it's not our last slide, it's our second to last slide. Really just wanted to thank you for attending today. There are other events for Transcelerate that you can always find on the Transcelerate website. And we do have a link to all of the tools we talked about today in the slides, which you'll get as a follow-up to this presentation. But I think we're also going to pop those in the chat, the link in the chat. So if you wanted to go look at what's in the tool or any of the tools, and if you have questions about them, we are going to move next to the Q&A. And in the Q&A, we'll try to address questions both that were pre-submitted in the registration. We tried to address some of those during the presentation today, but there might be some we didn't get to. So we'll talk about the pre-submitted questions, but you can also submit questions now, and just make sure you put the questions in the Q&A, not in the chat. I think I said that right. So if you put your question in the Q&A, and then they'll get fed through to us. And I think that's the next slide as we move to Q&A.